On a bitter winter morning in a forgotten square, a young woman gives her last piece of bread to a starving stranger, expecting nothing in return. Hours later, as the royal carriages pass, she sees him again, no longer ragged, but crowned. What began as a quiet act of kindness becomes the spark that defies a kingdom's expectations, risking scandal, exile, and a future rewritten by love. Because sometimes the smallest gesture changes everything. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. Winter pressed its full weight on the city of Prague, the kind of cold that did not merely bite but lingered, seeping through mortar, under doors, into the folds of garments and down into the marrow. Snow fell in heavy, reluctant flakes over the stone facades of the old square, veiling its proud statues and timbered rooftops in a muted white shroud. The city looked like it had fallen asleep mid-prayer, quiet and still, every corner hushed beneath the silence of frost. Under the groaning arch of a crumbling arcade, Annika Varga stepped carefully along the icy stones, her worn boots slipping now and then, catching on cobbled ridges as she moved toward the baker's alley. A reed-woven basket hung from the crook of her elbow, its contents pitiful. A single, rock-hard heel of bread, the last remnant of yesterday's supper. She kept her gloved hands buried deep in her woolen mitts, though the cold still bit through the seams. Her breath escaped in bursts, curling upward like smoke, vanishing into the grey hush. Her coat was threadbare at the sleeves, and beneath her shawl, the stiff wind reached straight to her skin. The richer folk had vanished indoors, their chimneys puffing thick plumes above shuttered windows, while the rest, those with empty pockets and hollow eyes, drifted like ghosts across the square. Mothers clutched pale children beneath their cloaks. Men huddled near shopfronts, mouths closed and expressions slack with quiet endurance. No voices carried in the wind. It was a world made of cold and silence, and everything felt suspended between need and resignation. Annika passed the old well, its stone lip covered in snow, and turned toward the alley she knew. It was here always that the baker's boy would sometimes offer the unwanted crusts, hard and blackened at the edges. He hadn't promised anything today, but hunger was a language spoken without words. She had nothing left to trade except the bread she meant to barter. But if it earned her one ladle of broth or even a pinch of flour, it would be worth the sacrifice. Just as she reached the edge of the square, she slowed. Someone, caught her attention in the shadowed archway between two shuttered shops. A man sat slumped against the stone wall, motionless, but not quite collapsed. He didn't beg, didn't speak. His hands were clenched at his sides, his posture upright even in exhaustion. His head rested back against the wall, and from a distance, his stillness could have been mistaken for death. But it wasn't death. It was pride. The kind that refused to bend, even when the body was too weak to rise. His face was difficult to see beneath the grime and the scruff of several days' growth. His dark hair clung to his brow, damp with melting snow, and his jaw was sharp beneath the dirt. A worn wool coat hung from his frame, its seams splitting, its collar turned up as if to hide what the world no longer cared to see. But it was his boots that caught her attention. Black leather, cracked and scuffed now, but unmistakably once fine. Too fine for a man sleeping in the street. Military, perhaps, or court-issued. A noble fallen low. A deserter, or simply someone misplaced by the world. Something stirred in her. Not fear, not pity, but a strange pull, like familiarity without memory. She didn't think. Her hand moved before her mind caught up. She stepped closer, each footfall muffled by the snow, and knelt beside him, drawing the bread from her basket. The man's eyes opened, as if awakened by scent alone. They were dark, gray, perhaps, or black, but hollow with hunger. Yet even so, he did not ask, did not reach. His gaze locked onto hers with a kind of disbelief, as though the offer itself were a cruelty. She held the bread out, gently, without a word. He didn't move. She placed it in his gloved palm. His fingers closed over it slowly, as though the act itself caused pain. When he looked at her, there was no gratitude in his face. Not yet. There was only something sharp and raw, like shame. Their eyes met, and for one suspended second, it felt like something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or an understanding too fragile to name. Then she stood. Without waiting for thanks, she turned and walked away, the hem of her skirt brushing softly against her boots. The wind caught the end of her shawl and tugged it like a child, but she didn't look back. Her chest ached, not from the cold, but from something heavier. The act had cost her, small though it seemed, yet she did not regret it. The square faded behind her, its silence wrapping around the buildings like a curtain. The moment lingered. It stayed with her through every step down the snow-lined path that led toward the edge of the quarter, where narrow lanes twisted into a clutter of chimney smoke and linen lines. She reached the low wooden door of the cottage she shared with her younger brother and father and pushed it open with her shoulder. The warmth inside was barely there. A thin fire crackled in the hearth, and her father's coughing echoed through the single room. He lay curled beneath a patched quilt, his skin pale, eyes closed. Her brother, Matthias, sat near the window, oil lamp beside him, cutting candle stubs in half to make them last. He glanced up when she entered. "Nothing?" he asked. Annika shook her head and hung her shawl near the stove. She set the empty basket down, her fingers now stinging as warmth crept back into them. The bell from St. Nicholas tolled once, then again. Noon. She stepped to the window. The snow had begun to thin. Pale sunlight broke through a crack in the clouds, casting gold across the rooftops. The air felt like it had shifted somehow, as if the stillness of morning had given way to something more expectant. Matthias stood behind her. "We should go," he said, tugging at her sleeve. "To the promenade." Annika turned to him. "You said we wouldn't," she replied. "Everyone will be there. The king's procession passes the palace steps. We'll see carriages, maybe a brass band. We'll see boots and velvet. We'll see people," he insisted, "and it's warmer near the crowds." He was right about that. Still, she hesitated. Her thoughts drifted back to the man in the square. She tried to dismiss the memory, but it clung to her. His eyes, the way he hadn't spoken, hadn't begged. How the act of giving had felt like an intrusion rather than a gift. It had unsettled her. And yet, something about it stayed with her. By the time they reached the edge of the plaza near the palace gates, the sun had burned through the last of the low clouds, illuminating the snow-covered rooftops like alabaster. People packed the square, children perched atop barrels or fathers' shoulders, women clutching hot bricks wrapped in cloth to keep their fingers warm. Men leaned forward, scanning the gates with narrowed eyes. Annika stood near the edge, her brother fidgeting beside her, craning his neck. A trumpet sounded from inside the palace. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Guards emerged first, stepping in perfect rhythm down the central path. Behind them came the musicians, horns gleaming in the sunlight, drums thudding in somber cadence. The palace gates, tall and gilded, swung open slowly with the creak of iron and the weight of ceremony. The first carriage appeared, dark blue with gold trim, the royal crest embossed on its side. Horses in braided harnesses stamped their hooves, and the crowd surged slightly forward. Inside the carriage, seated beside the Queen Dowager, in full formal attire, was a man. He was upright, clean, composed. His coat was of deep navy velvet. A silver sash crossed his chest. His boots gleamed, polished to mirror shine. But Annika saw only his face. It was the man from the square, washed, crowned, alive with the breath of ceremony. Her heart lurched. The bread she gave him now felt like the beginning of something she could not undo. The crowd outside Prague Castle pressed together in a tight sea of wool and breath, shoulders brushing, scarves wrapped high, boots shifting in the packed snow. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, and fathers hoisted the smallest onto their backs. The air was thick with heat and chill at once, warm from bodies packed closely, but threaded with cold wind that slid through every opening, biting at ankles and fingertips. The clamor of anticipation rose like a tide, voices murmuring and rising with each trumpet call echoing off the stone walls of the palace. Annika stood near the edge of the procession, where the crowds were dense but not suffocating. Her younger brother pressed close at her side. The hem of her skirt had soaked through where it brushed the melting snow, and she could feel the damp creeping up her stockings, cold and insistent. The wool shawl around her shoulders had gathered tiny beads of snow, but she barely noticed. Her gloved hands were clasped beneath it, still and tight, as her eyes scanned the wide avenue that led from the palace gates. Trumpets blared again, long, sharp notes that cut through the chatter and silenced the mass. The rustle of fabric and crunch of boots gave way to stillness. All eyes turned toward the gilded gates as they creaked open with ceremonial slowness. A flurry of movement stirred behind the ironwork. Guards in navy and gold emerged first, boots striking the cobblestones in precise rhythm. Then came the palace musicians, horns raised, drums pulsing low beneath the fanfare. The procession had begun. Annika watched without interest. She had seen it once before as a child. Gleaming horses, velvet-clad nobility, embroidered coats heavier than practical clothing had any right to be. It had seemed magical then. Now it felt like spectacle, distant and irrelevant to the world she knew, where wood had to be chopped before sunrise, and potatoes were sometimes dinner and sometimes not. Matthias was on tiptoe beside her, craning his neck. She let him lean against her, her eyes half-lidded. But then the main carriage rolled forward, and everything changed. It was the largest of the procession, deep blue, with gold trim curling like vines around its windows. The royal crest, twin lions and sword, gleamed on the door. The crowd roared around her, but Annika didn't hear them. Her gaze had narrowed to the man seated inside, clean-shaven, upright, clad in dark velvet and a silver sash. His bearing was composed, his expression unreadable. He sat beside the Queen Dowager, who wore a black fur-lined cloak and a headdress studded with pearls. Her profile was sharp, carved in cold elegance. But Annika barely noticed the Queen, because the man beside her, the prince, was the man from the square. She knew it instantly, with a certainty that made her stomach twist. Though the dirt had been scrubbed away, though his coat now fit like a glove and his hair gleamed with oil, it was him. That same jawline, those same eyes. She had seen them hollow with hunger, seen them study her in disbelief. And now they looked out over the crowd with the same guarded sharpness, scanning faces quickly, methodically, as though searching for something. Her breath caught. It wasn't a gasp. It was sharper, tighter. Her heart gave a strange lurch inside her chest. The noise around her fell away, as if she'd stepped into a space without sound. His gaze swept past her once, then returned, paused, and held. For a second, he looked at her. No nod. No recognition in the formal sense. But something flickered across his face. A break in the polished mask. Then, almost as quickly, it was gone. His attention shifted. The Queen turned to say something, and he leaned slightly toward her, nodding once. When he straightened again, his face was composed, even distant. The carriage continued its slow progress toward the palace steps. Annika did not move, could not move. Her brother murmured something at her side, tugged her hand, but she barely felt it. Had he truly recognized her? Was he pretending not to? Or had she only imagined it all, mistaken his face, his expression, the moment between them in the square? Her chest felt tight beneath the shawl. It wasn't fear exactly, nor shame. It was a kind of disorientation, as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted just enough to make her uncertain. She was no one. He was that. The procession continued. More carriages followed, smaller, carrying lesser nobility. Officials waved, musicians bowed their heads as they passed. But Annika no longer saw them. She kept her gaze on the wide stone steps, where the royal family was now disembarking. The queen stepped down with a gloved hand, resting on a steward's arm. The prince followed, his movement fluid, measured, like someone born to have the world step aside for him. And yet, he glanced over his shoulder once more before entering the palace. His face was still unreadable, but he looked. Her brother pulled at her sleeve. "We've seen enough," he said. "Come on." But she didn't move. One by one, the nobles and officials retreated into the palace. The great iron gates creaked closed behind them, and the crowd slowly began to scatter, voices rising again in low hums of conversation. Some children clambered onto steps for a final glimpse. Vendors began packing up their carts. The day had begun again, ordinary beneath the gloss of ceremony. Still, Annika remained rooted, her eyes fixed on the place where the prince had stood. Her breath came shallowly. Her fingers trembled inside her mitts. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps only to convince herself it had happened at all. And then, near the end of the departing procession, just as the guards began to pull back toward the gates, a small commotion stirred near one of the carriages. A man in royal livery stepped down from the side door. He was tall, his cloak heavy with the weight of embroidery, and a fur collar sat stiff around his shoulders. He scanned the square methodically, his posture unmistakably purposeful. This was not a guard watching for danger, nor a courtier seeking applause. This man was looking for someone. His gaze moved with calm precision, sweeping the crowd from left to right, his eyes flicking over the faces of lingering townsfolk. Then they stopped. On her. Annika stiffened. The man stepped forward with quiet urgency, walking in a straight line toward her. People parted instinctively. Her brother took a step back, staring. The air felt suddenly thinner. The man stopped in front of her. In his gloved hands, he held a small object, wrapped in deep blue velvet. He unfolded it with slow care to reveal a gold-embroidered handkerchief, its corners edged with intricate stitching, and resting in the center, like a relic, was a single crust of bread, untouched. He looked at her and spoke clearly. "His Highness would like to return what you gave him this morning." The silence that followed the aide's words pressed in like snowfall. Soft, suffocating, complete. The square around her buzzed faintly with the dispersing crowd, footsteps over slush, voices trailing in the distance, but none of it reached her. Annika stared at the gold-embroidered cloth in the man's outstretched hands, and at the small, pale crust of bread resting in its center, untouched. Absurd and reverent all at once. A relic made of desperation and instinct. Heat surged to her cheeks. She hadn't expected this impossible, ceremonial gesture. It felt as though something fragile had been pulled from the deepest part of her and placed in full view of the world. She took half a step back, her hands tightening at her sides, unsure whether to laugh or run. The instinct to flee roared to life in her legs, but her feet held fast. Beside her, Matthias gave a quiet, startled sound. "Annika," he hissed under his breath, tugging at her sleeve. "What is this? What did you do?" She shook her head quickly. "Nothing," she said, though the word tasted false. The aide remained still. His face was unreadable, his bearing formal but not unkind. He looked at her not as a servant would a common girl, but as if she were part of something chosen. Carefully he folded the cloth again, enclosing the bread as though it were an offering too sacred for the open air. Then he drew a sealed envelope from the inner fold of his coat and held it out to her. The wax was pale gold, pressed with the royal crest. With a short, impeccable bow, he stepped back and returned to the line of carriages. Matthias was speaking again, something sharp, something about leaving. But Annika could no longer hear him. Her fingers closed around the envelope, and the weight of it, though slight, felt enormous. No one around them seemed to have noticed the exchange. No whispers, no glances. And yet it felt as though every pair of eyes in Prague were suddenly on her, watching, judging, waiting. She didn't speak again until they reached the edge of the square. Her thoughts were scattered, half memory, half disbelief. At home, she moved through the small cottage like a shadow. Her father lay in bed near the fire, propped up on one elbow, his breath wheezing slightly from the cold air. He looked at her with concern as she entered, but she said little, only unfastened her shawl and set the envelope gently on the table as though it might bruise. It took her nearly an hour to find the courage to break the seal. She sat on the bench beside the hearth, the glow of the fire flickering across her hands. The wax crumbled softly beneath her thumb. The letter inside was smooth, folded with precision. The handwriting, small, firm, precise. The message was brief. Your kindness this morning did not go unnoticed. I would speak with you if you will allow it. You may come to the palace at sunset. Present this letter at the gate. L. No threats. No instructions, no escort. Just an invitation, and yet it felt like an edict. She read it twice, then a third time, heart racing more with each pass. When her father stirred, she quickly folded the letter and slid it beneath the edge of the table. You've gone pale, he said quietly, his voice rough with illness. What happened? Matthias, seated near the stove, crossed his arms tightly. She met someone. At the square. Her father's eyes, bloodshot with fever, flicked toward her face. Someone. Noble? I didn't know he was, she murmured. Matthias scoffed, but her father looked at her with a deeper worry. Don't go, he said. Whatever this is, it's not for us. She didn't answer, not then, because the truth was she didn't know what it was. Not really. A gesture, a curiosity, something worse. But that night, she didn't sleep. She turned the letter over in her hands a dozen times. She sat by the hearth long after her brother and father drifted into uneasy slumber. And in the quiet, her thoughts circled back. Not to the man she'd seen in the carriage, polished and royal, but to the man on the stone, slumped with frost clinging to his collar, refusing to beg, refusing to break. The weight of his silence, the tremble in his hand as he took the bread, that fleeting moment of stillness between them. By the time the sun began to sink low in the sky, casting the rooftops in hues of pale gold and faint rose, she had already decided. She dressed slowly, choosing her mother's old shawl, the thick one, the one trimmed with faded burgundy thread, and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders. She combed her hair back and braided it into a long plait. Her boots, scuffed and weather-worn, were brushed clean, though they still bore cracks from the last snow. She left without a word, only a glance at her father, who watched her go with a look of helpless warning. Matthias didn't speak to her as she passed the threshold. The city was quieter than it had been that morning. The crowds had dispersed, and only the echo of their footsteps remained between the buildings. Frost gathered at the corners of windows. Oil lamps flickered behind curtains. The cold was sharper now, cutting and dry, but she barely felt it. When she reached the palace gates, her breath was visible in clouds. The guards stood tall, rifles at their sides, their coats gleaming beneath the torchlight. She hesitated only a moment before presenting the envelope, folded once again and still bearing the royal seal. The older guard took it, opened it, and scanned the brief note. Without a word, he nodded and gestured her forward. The gate creaked open. Annika stepped inside. She had never walked these stones, never passed beneath these archways. The air inside the palace walls was quieter, heavier. The corridors were wide, lined with polished wood and marble, lit by brass gas lamps that hissed gently. Her shoes made almost no sound as she followed the servant who met her at the entry, a woman in dark skirts and no expression, who led her through halls she could not name. Past tapestries, past towering doors carved with coats of arms, past alcoves filled with gilded statues that seemed to watch her with cold judgment. At last, they reached a smaller door, plain, almost modest, tucked near a bend in the corridor. The servant opened it without knocking, and Annika stepped inside alone. The room was warm. Firelight glowed across polished floorboards and leather-bound books. There was no velvet, no gold, no jewels. Only a quiet, private space that smelled faintly of paper and wood smoke. She stood there, unsure, her hands folded tightly beneath her shawl. The door clicked shut behind her. She waited. 1 minute. 2. Then, from the far corner, a narrow panel in the wall opened, seamless, nearly invisible, and he stepped through. Not a prince in the way she had seen him on the promenade. Not dressed in blue velvet or silver. No guards, no crown. Just a man in a dark coat, shirt undone at the collar, his hair slightly mussed, as though he'd stripped away the title before entering. He closed the hidden door behind him, leaned against it for a moment, and looked at her. Long, quiet, intently. Then finally, he spoke. You knew who I was, and you still gave it to me. Why? Levente's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that settled across the room like a velvet mantle, heavy with the authority of someone born into command, honed through years of careful observation and unyielding control. His words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They landed between them like a blade, fine and deliberate. Annika's spine stiffened. Her first instinct was to step back, to lower her head, to vanish into the worn folds of her shawl. Somewhere deep in her childhood memory, she could feel the scolding whispers of village elders. Don't look too long. Don't speak unless spoken to. But she didn't move. Her feet held. Her breath trembled, but her chin stayed lifted. I didn't know, she said, the words leaving her mouth more clipped than she intended. You looked like someone no one would help. So I did. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, he was too practiced for that, but something quieter, like disbelief pulling gently at the edge of hope. His posture slackened just slightly, a muscle easing in his jaw. He didn't speak again at once. Instead, he turned and walked past her, toward the fire that glowed at the hearth. The flames licked the edge of the logs in small, steady flickers, casting warm light across the polished floorboards. He stopped in front of the hearth, his back to her for a moment. When he turned again, he gestured to the chair nearest him. Not an order. Not even an invitation spoken aloud. Just a simple motion of his hand, waiting. Annika hesitated, her heart drumming fast in her chest. She crossed the room slowly, aware of how soft her footsteps sounded in the heavy silence. The chair creaked faintly as she sat. Her fingers knotted together in her lap, knuckles white beneath the tension in her arms. Every sense she possessed felt heightened, the warmth of the fire against her legs, the faint scent of ink and smoke, the quiet sound of his breath. He didn't sit, not yet. He moved toward the window, where frost crept like lace across the panes. For a moment, he stood there with his arms folded, gaze turned outward toward the city. Then he spoke again, softly, almost as if confessing to himself. I left the palace 4 days ago, he said, alone, without telling anyone. She stared at him, startled. Why? He turned his head slightly, enough for her to see the profile of his face, that same strong jaw, the dark sweep of lashes over his cheek. Because I was tired of being told what my kingdom looks like, he said. Tired of maps and figures and ministers who only speak of farms in numbers and people in terms of labor. I wanted to see the truth, not the court's version of it. He crossed the room and leaned against the mantel, his arms folding loosely, his gaze now on her again, steady, unguarded. So I dressed in old clothes, he continued, and walked out the back gate. No guards. No servants. I stayed in the alley behind a printer's shop. I slept near the river for a night. I wandered until the cold started to press so hard I thought I might stop feeling anything at all. Annika couldn't look away. His voice had dropped lower now, quieter, and the words struck something in her. Not just sympathy, but understanding. I thought maybe I'd be recognized, he said. That someone would know me. But no one did. No one saw me. Not the guards, not the vendors, not the woman who stepped over my leg like I wasn't there. He paused. Until you. The words settled into the room like snow, light and devastating. Annika felt her breath catch, her hands tightening in her lap. You saw me, he said, and this time there was no formality in his voice at all. Not who I was, not the title, just me. She didn't know what to say. What reply could possibly be enough? The room felt too close now, too intimate. Her heart beat wildly in her chest, but she didn't move. She couldn't. It was madness. A prince telling her these things, as though she was someone who belonged in the walls of this place. She wasn't. She was wearing borrowed time, sitting in a chair that cost more than a year of bread. And yet, she didn't feel out of place. Not with him looking at her like that. The fire popped gently behind them. He stepped forward and sat at last, lowering himself into the chair across from her. His legs were long, stretched out toward the hearth. His fingers steepled loosely beneath his chin. They sat in silence for a few moments, watching each other. The air between them had changed. Not dangerous, but volatile, as if something was building just beneath the surface. Recognition, perhaps, or something far more difficult to name. I don't know why I came, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect to be here, he finished. To be noticed. He gave the smallest shake of his head, and for the first time his lips curved, not into a smile, but something close. Neither did I. The hour deepened. The light outside faded from gold to violet, then to black. Shadows crept long across the rugs and up the walls. The flames in the hearth hissed and settled, casting flickering gold across the lines of his face. And then, just as Annika had started to think she'd forgotten where she was, that maybe the world outside had stilled entirely, a knock landed on the door. It was sharp, controlled. Levente stood at once. The change in him was immediate. The easy posture vanished, replaced by something practiced, formal. His shoulders straightened. His jaw tightened. He crossed the room and opened the door himself. A tall woman entered without waiting for invitation. She moved with the elegance of command, her silhouette dark against the light from the hall. She wore a gown of black silk, the hem barely skimming the polished floor, and her sleeves glinted with fine jet beadwork. A silver comb held her pale hair swept in a coiled twist, and her face, severe, beautiful, ageless, bore no trace of surprise. Queen Dowager Ilona. Her eyes moved over the room once, briefly, the fire, the chairs, the figures, then settled on Annika, cold, measuring, precise. Her voice when she spoke was calm, so calm it seemed to cut through the warmth of the fire itself. What is this peasant doing in my son's chamber? The silence that followed Queen Ilona's question stretched long and sharp, like the blade of a drawn sword between them. The flickering light from the hearth threw fractured shadows along the parquet floor, illuminating nothing but the widening stillness of the room. It was not the silence of confusion or hesitation. It was the silence of control, of power held in check, of tension drawn taut. Annika rose slowly, her legs stiff with fear she refused to show. Her fingers closed around the edge of her shawl, not for comfort, but for something to hold, something to keep her upright. The queen's presence was like cold iron, elegant, deadly, immovable. Annika didn't know whether to speak or to leave. Her heart beat high and wild in her chest, but she would not let it show in her face. Not in front of this woman. Before she could move, Levente stepped forward. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the deliberate composure of a man who knew the value of each gesture. He positioned himself between them, not blocking his mother, not shielding Annika, but placing his presence where it could not be ignored. She is a guest, he said, his voice level. A kind one, a helpful one. The queen's expression didn't shift. Her eyes remained on Annika's face, ice-colored and steady, not searching, not assessing. measuring. The silence following Levente's words was somehow colder than her arrival. Ilona said nothing for several long seconds. Then she turned her gaze to her son, just slightly, her chin lifting a fraction. "Escort the girl to the front gate," she said. "Now." It wasn't an outburst. It wasn't a reprimand. It was a decision, delivered with the kind of absolute authority that made explanation unnecessary. Annika's throat tightened, but she gave a small nod, willing her hands not to tremble. She stepped around the chair with quiet dignity and crossed to the doorway, where Levente now stood, his face expressionless, his posture tense. They walked side by side down the corridor, the thick carpet muffling their footfalls. Neither of them spoke until they passed the last sconce and reached the cool draft of the front vestibule, where torchlight glowed against the polished stone floor. Levente halted before the heavy doors and turned to face her. He looked at her for a moment, searching for something, maybe guilt, maybe disappointment. But what showed instead was something more resigned. "I'm sorry," he said. But the words, though sincere, sounded distant. Not because they were false, but because they belonged to a man who had lived his life in a house where apologies were worthless, if not sanctioned by law or court. It was the apology of someone who could not undo what he'd been born into. Annika opened her mouth to reply, but found nothing to say. The cold outside now seemed preferable to the burn in her throat. "This isn't over," Levente added quietly. "Come again. Please, soon." She looked at him then, really looked. The edge of his collar still held the warmth of the fire. His eyes, dark beneath thick lashes, were guarded now, but not indifferent. Something in him reached toward her, even if the world around him pulled the opposite way. She gave the smallest nod and stepped through the open door. The air outside was colder than it had been. Her breath turned instantly to mist. The streets were emptier now, the gas lamps glowing faintly through curling frost. She walked without purpose, barely feeling her feet on the stone. By the time she reached the cottage, the lamps inside were low, the hearth a bed of soft embers. Her father was still awake, sitting propped up by blankets with a hollow look in his eyes. Mattia stood when she entered, his face lined with suspicion. "You went," he said flatly. She didn't reply. Her brother's mouth opened again, ready to speak, but something in her posture must have stopped him. She moved toward the hearth and sat down slowly on the bench, staring at the fire. Her hands were cold, and she tucked them beneath her arms. Her shawl still smelled faintly of the palace, a mixture of oil soap and polished wood, and something more elusive, something that clung to memory. Her father watched her quietly, his hand curled around his mug. He said only one thing before he lay down again. "Whatever it is, be careful." Annika sat there long after they'd both gone to sleep. The warmth of the room settled over her, but it didn't reach the thoughts circling her mind. The way he had looked at her, not just at the palace, but in the square. The way he had spoken, not as a prince, not even as a man used to being listened to, but as someone who hadn't expected to be seen at all. She could not sleep. When the first light of dawn filtered pale and cold through the windows, she was already awake. Her boots felt stiff as she laced them, her fingers numb. The frost had crept along the glass overnight in swirling patterns. She didn't light the stove, didn't speak to her brother who still lay beneath the woolen coverlet. She wrapped her shawl tighter and opened the door to the street, her breath escaping in a sharp gasp as the cold met her face. The sky was a pale grey. Smoke drifted from chimneys in slow, tired streams. The marketplace had barely begun to stir. Only a few carts stood beneath the groaning awnings, and shopkeepers were still stamping down ice at their thresholds. She didn't know where she was going exactly, only that her thoughts wouldn't settle unless she moved. The city felt quieter than usual. Or perhaps it was only that she was listening harder than before. Her feet led her back toward the old square, past shuttered windows and iron rails dusted with ice, past the stone well where the pigeons gathered in summer. The air sharpened as she turned the corner. She didn't see him until she nearly collided with him. Just a breath before contact, she stopped short, heart leaping to her throat. A cloaked figure stood in the shadows between two buildings, his form partially hidden in the dim morning light. He pulled back the hood slowly. It was Levente, alone. His hair was damp with cold, his eyes dark beneath the sharp lines of sleeplessness. The royal velvet was gone, his coat was plain, his boots dusted with frost. But his bearing, upright, intent, was unchanged. And this time he said, "I need your help." The frost lingered in the narrow alleys like breath that refused to fade. Beneath the worn stone arches of the old market arcade, the first merchants were setting up, breath clouding in the frigid air as they laid out bundles of onions and crusted loaves, chipped bowls, and hand-dyed wool. Smoke began to rise in thin ribbons from chimney pots, and the faint sound of a blacksmith's hammer carried from a distant corner. Morning had come not with fanfare, but with the slow, stubborn persistence of life returning to motion. Anika tightened her shawl around her shoulders as she turned toward the bakery lane, the soft crunch of frost beneath her boots, a quiet rhythm beneath her steps. The cold had stiffened her fingers, and she kept them tucked under her arms, half in thought, half in warmth. She had walked this path 100 times in her life, but today it felt different. Not for what she would find, but for what might be following behind her, or waiting ahead. She passed the shuttered window of the weaver's cottage when a movement caught the edge of her vision. From beneath the dim arch of the arcade, a figure stepped forward, hood low, cloak long and damp at the hem, boots leaving prints across the frost-darkened cobbles. It was Levente. He moved quickly, but not hurriedly. There was something urgent in the way he carried himself, not just in purpose, but in presence. The dampness of his cloak suggested he'd been out for hours, perhaps all night. His eyes looked tired but not dulled. Instead, they burned with something sharp beneath the surface. His gaze found hers, as if he'd known exactly where she would be. "I left the palace before dawn," he said, barely above a whisper. "No one saw me. No one knows I'm here." She opened her mouth to answer, but he held up a hand. "I didn't come to cause trouble. I came because I need something I can't get inside those walls. Not from my mother. Not from my advisors. Not from anyone who's spent their life pretending the kingdom is something it's not." Annika stood very still. Around them, the market stirred softly to life, the scrape of crates being moved, the creak of wagon wheels. No one seemed to notice the pair in the shadows, but still she drew her shawl closer around her, more from instinct than modesty. "What is it you want?" she asked. He exhaled once, breath white in the cold air. "I want you to show me the city, the real city. The one my ministers keep off the ledges, the one I tried to see 4 nights ago before I collapsed into that alley. I thought I knew where to go, but I only knew what I'd been told. I want to see what's behind the facades, the weaving houses, the barges, the bread lines. You know where they are. You live it." Annika's heart beat louder in her ears. "And if someone sees you?" "I've come this far without being recognized," he said. "If you'll help me, I can keep going." Her breath caught. She understood the risk, both his and hers. To walk beside the crown prince, even in common dress, was not a thing done without consequences, even if no one noticed, especially if they did. But what struck her was not his desperation. It was his resolve. There was no arrogance in him, no command in his voice, only a hunger that went deeper than food. He wanted truth. "I'll take you," she said quietly. "But you don't speak to anyone, not a word, and you keep your head down. If someone even suspects—" He nodded. "I understand." She turned, and he followed. They moved through the city by foot, weaving through narrow corridors where the buildings leaned together like old men in conversation. They passed shops that hadn't yet opened, their windows fogged with cold, and stairwells that led downward into cellars where workers took refuge from the wind. She took him past the southern quay, where coal barges sat half-loaded, and children carried buckets of soot-black ice back to shared hearths. He didn't ask questions. He only watched. She took him through the laundry streets where steam rose from open drains and girls stood barefoot on wet stones, wringing grey water from linens too coarse to whiten. They passed a building with no roof, where women worked looms in rooms open to the sky, the wind threading through their shawls as they bent over wooden frames. She showed him the bakeries where one loaf might feed 3 families, if it was even real bread and not flour padded with sawdust. They spoke little, only when necessary, but a rhythm formed between them, a silence that was not cold, only full. She would point, and he would follow. She would slow, and he would match her pace. There was a quiet intimacy in it, unspoken and immediate. In the late afternoon, as the winter light turned thin and silvery, she led him to a crumbling chapel near the edge of the quarter. The doors hung crooked on their hinges, and the stone steps were slick with old frost. Inside, the walls bore traces of once bright frescoes, now faded to pale ghosts. The air smelled of stone and damp ash. They stepped through what remained of the nave, past a few broken pews, and settled near a low alcove where someone had once built a fire, long dead now, only ashes, and the memory of warmth remaining. Levente sat on the step of the altar, his shoulders hunched slightly, his cloak drawn tight. "They survive," he said softly. "But it's not life." Annika stood beside a cracked pillar, her hands wrapped around her elbows. "They survive together. That's what keeps them." He looked up at her. "They share," she said. "When they can. Not because they have enough, but because it's the only way to make not enough feel like something." He watched her in silence, and in that silence was something shifting. He no longer looked at her the way men looked at women from afar, or nobles looked at peasants. He looked at her like a man seeing someone for the first time in a language he didn't know he spoke. The last light of day glimmered through a broken stained glass panel above them, casting faint hues of blue and amber across the dust-laden air. Her profile glowed in the fading sun, and his eyes remained fixed on her. Not like a prince, but like a man lost in thought. He couldn't explain. She didn't notice. She'd turned toward the far end of the room, where someone had left a bundle of sticks and a half-burned taper. "We should go," she said. "It'll be dark soon." He stood, brushing frost from his cloak. "Thank you," he said. She turned back to face him. Before either of them could take another step, a low rustling echoed from the shadows near the chapel's side alcove. Annika stilled. A tall figure stepped forward from the darkness, the slow, deliberate sound of leather soles against stone echoing in the vast, hollow space. His coat was black wool, tailored close to his body, gloves, a ring that caught the last of the light. His hair was brushed back, silver at the temples, his expression unreadable. He looked at them both. Then he spoke, his voice smooth as a blade. "Your Highness." Levente didn't move. Annika's breath caught. The man stepped closer, unhurried. "I believe," he said. "It's time to return to the palace, before this foolishness damages the crown any further." Then, with a slight inclination of his head, he added, "Baron Caroly, at your service." Baron Caroly's presence shattered the fragile hush of the chapel like a window cracked from its frame. The stillness they had shared only moments ago dissipated beneath the crisp edge of the Baron's voice, his words low but cutting with practiced finesse. His polished boots clicked against the uneven stone as he approached, gloves folded neatly behind his back, his coat gleaming faintly where it caught the last of the dying light. Levente stepped forward instinctively, his stance shifting, subtle but protective. His shoulder aligned itself just slightly in front of Annika, not with violence, but with an authority that spoke of bloodlines and old instinct. The prince's jaw was set, his eyes unreadable. Baron Caroly raised one brow, not surprised, not bothered. He looked between them as though measuring the distance and calculating its cost. Then, with a single movement of his hand, he gestured toward the door, precise, civil, unrelenting. "This way, Highness," he said with the tone of someone who had already allowed too much. No one argued. They stepped out into the street. The cold hit them at once, dry and bitter. The sun had vanished, and night was pressing in fast, the shadows from the buildings thickening over the frozen alleys. Frost glimmered on the cobblestones, the faint shimmer of it catching in the gaslight like powdered glass. None of them spoke at first. Their footfalls echoed in a rhythmic trio. Levente, tall and silent. Annika, half a step behind, her shawl tight around her shoulders. And Carolee, unhurried but certain, leading them back through the heart of a city he believed he understood. It was the Baron who broke the silence first. "You've been gone longer than you should have," he said evenly, not looking back. 4 nights is a long time for a future king to vanish. Levente said nothing. "I didn't report you," Carolee continued, "not because I condone this excursion, but because I know your mother, and I know her limits." He slowed his steps, turning his head slightly toward Levente. "She tolerates many things in silence, but disobedience is not one of them." Levente's voice was quiet. "I was not disobedient." Carolee smiled faintly. "You were absent. That's enough. What you call observation, she calls rebellion. And rebellion, even silent, princely rebellion, is not something she overlooks." The alley narrowed, and the air thickened with the scent of coal smoke and wet brick. Annika walked behind them, silent, but listening, her breath shallow. The sound of her boots brushing over the frost was the only rhythm that reminded her she hadn't vanished into the stone around them. She didn't belong here, not in this conversation, not in this story, and yet she couldn't seem to look away from the lines drawn between these men. At the palace gates, the guards stood straighter at the sight of the Baron. They opened the small side entrance without question. The iron groaned slightly on its hinges, and the orange torchlight inside spilled out across the flagstones like fire over ice. Baron Carolee stopped before crossing the threshold. He turned, slowly, and looked down at Annika. There was no insult in his expression, no disdain, only a quiet, unwavering certainty. "You seem clever," he said. "So I'll speak plainly. You're not made for this place. And no matter how sincere your intentions, proximity to His Highness will only damage you both." Annika met his gaze, though her hands clenched beneath her shawl. Her face showed nothing. Levente stepped forward. "That's enough." But the Baron only gave a slight nod. "Your Highness," he said calmly. Then, with a faint smile at Annika, he added, "Good evening, miss." He disappeared into the palace. Levente turned to her. The torchlight struck his features in warm tones, eyes dark, jaw tense. The expression he wore was one she hadn't seen before. It wasn't anger. It was something harder to define, the look of a man balancing too many levers with too little space to move. "I'll write to you," he said. "You'll hear from me soon. I swear it." She nodded. But the tightness in his voice, the way his fingers curled into fists at his sides, she could see the pressure gathering in him, like a storm behind glass. He watched her go until the darkness of the lane swallowed her up. That night, Annika walked home in a haze of questions. Her breath was sharp in her lungs, her shawl damp from the chill that had sunk deep into the fabric. The streets were quieter now, and the few lamps left burning flickered like thoughts she couldn't catch. At home, her brother paced before the hearth, stopping only when she opened the door. "Where have you been?" he asked sharply, but she brushed past him. She had no words, only images. Levente standing in the chapel, Levente beneath the arch of the market, Levente vanishing through the gate with his back straight and his face too still. Their connection, whatever it was, felt thinner now, drawn across a distance not just of space but of power, of structure, of strategy. Inside the palace, Levente felt it too. It began slowly, almost invisibly. The following morning, 2 guards stood at the end of the corridor outside his rooms. Not uncommon. But they hadn't been there the day before. At breakfast, the letters he'd dictated were left unsigned by his valet. The steward claimed confusion. The next day, they simply weren't there at all. When he asked to receive a visitor, one of the lesser court ministers, someone harmless, the request was delayed. No word came from Annika. He waited. Then he wrote again. 2 lines, folded neatly, sealed himself. No reply. He wrote again, and again. Nothing. It wasn't until the 3rd day, when he noticed his chamberlain hesitating at the edge of the room, that the truth began to scrape its way to the surface. His words were being stopped before they could leave the palace. On the 4th night, long after the halls had quieted and only the outer guards remained at their posts, Levente left his rooms without a coat. He walked quickly, barefoot on the velvet carpet, silent as the hush of snow falling beyond the palace walls. He knew where the steward's office was kept, tucked near the servants' passage, past the wine cellar. A place few nobles ever entered. He picked the lock with a stolen pin. The drawer he opened was stiff from disuse, the wood swollen at the corners. He pulled it wide. Inside, stacked and folded with uncanny precision, were the letters. Everyone addressed to Annika Varga, everyone unopened, except the last. Its seal was cracked, its fold worn. His hands trembled as he pulled them out, the ink smudged from pressure, the parchment still faintly scented with wax and starch. 6 letters in all. Hidden, denied, forgotten by no one. Behind him, a soft sound split the quiet. He turned. Queen Dowager Ilona stood in the doorway, her expression carved from marble, her face unreadable in the low light. Her voice was soft, but it sliced like ice. "If you will not choose duty," she said, "I will make the choice for you." The light in the steward's office had barely touched the corners of the room when the Queen's voice cut through it. Levente didn't speak, not immediately. He stood with the stack of opened letters clutched in one hand, the other braced against the desk as though to anchor himself to the floor. His eyes didn't shift from her, though the coldness of her words sent something low and burning through his chest. The following morning, his world narrowed. Doors that once opened at his approach now remained closed. His attendants rotated without warning. The steward who had once served him with silent competence was reassigned. A new valet, quieter and less willing to make eye contact, replaced him. The guards stationed at his corridor did not speak. They nodded stiffly and never left their post. Levente was not confined to a cell. Nothing so vulgar would be allowed within the palace. No, his was a gilded restraint, wrapped in silk and measured steps. He could walk within the private wing. He could request books. He could sit in the garden, though only when accompanied. But he could not send letters. He could not receive guests, and he could not leave. The Queen called it a necessary period of reflection. In truth, it was a tightening of chains he'd never asked to wear. She came to him once, 3 days after the steward's office, dressed in mourning black, despite the lack of any recent death. She sat across from him at the long dining table in the east parlor, the silverware gleaming untouched between them. "Your silence," she said, "is the only part of this situation that gives me hope." He said nothing, staring out the window. Beyond the frosted glass, a winter wren darted across the courtyard and disappeared into a hedge. She unfolded a letter from Vienna. The seal was pale blue, the crest pressed deep and clean. "The Archduke's daughter has accepted the proposal," she said. "She will arrive for the winter court, and your betrothal will be announced before foreign dignitaries and representatives of the empire. It is your duty, Levente, not your wish. And it is not up for discussion." Still, he did not speak. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "You were born to carry something heavier than your own heart. I raised you for that." She left the letter on the table when she rose. The door closed behind her with the hush of soft wood and finality. Whispers moved quickly beyond the palace gates. Rumors like wind couldn't be caught or traced. The people of Prague heard them in half-sentences, of royal promises, of Viennese titles, of unions made not for love, but for lineage. Some said the prince had gone quiet, others said he had been reprimanded. But no one knew the truth. Annika knew only silence. Each morning she woke before the light touched the rooftops. She boiled water, she gathered her shawl, she went to the workhouse. No letter came, no knock, no sign. At first she thought perhaps he had been forbidden. Then she wondered if he had been convinced, or worse, ashamed. Her brother said, "You should never have spoken to him at all." Her father said, "Royalty marries royalty. It's the way of the world." She said nothing, but something inside her shifted. Not bitterness, not despair, something colder, steadier. The knowledge that what she had tasted had not been a dream, but a moment. And moments could not be kept. She began volunteering at the weaving house. She wound bobbins with stiff fingers. She stitched worn hems. She carried scraps of bread to mothers waiting near the corner kitchens. Her hands stayed busy even when her heart did not. The other women did not ask her about the palace, but they looked. Now and then, when she passed, their eyes flicked up. Not cruel, not mocking, just curious, careful. On the morning of the betrothal, the air was dry and cold, the kind that made doors stick and wood crackle in its frame. Snow had not fallen, but the ground held a crisp sheen, like sugar crusted across every surface. The sky was flat and pale, without color. Annika stood in the courtyard behind the weaving house, rolling flour across a rough slab of dough. Her sleeves were pushed to her elbows. Her cheeks burned with the cold. Her breath rose in small clouds as she pressed her palms into the dough's surface. A soft sound behind her made her glance up. He stood at the edge of the courtyard. Levente. The breath left her lungs so quickly she almost staggered. He wore a dark cloak, simple and travel-worn. His boots were splattered with frost and earth. His hair was tousled by wind, his cheeks flushed from running. He looked the way he had in the square the first time she saw him, without polish, without court. Just a man. Her hands froze over the dough. The women around her began to notice. One dropped her spool. Another murmured something and stepped back. Annika's gaze locked on his. Disbelief warred with something sharper. Her chest tightened. She took one step forward, and then her eyes changed. From disbelief to fury. Her mouth opened, but whatever words she meant to say were swallowed by the sound of wheels on cobblestone. A carriage, lacquered black, trimmed with brass and bearing the royal crest, pulled into the alley at the edge of the courtyard. Its arrival silenced every movement. Its horses steamed from the mouth, harnesses glinting in the morning light. The door opened. Queen Dowager Ilona stepped down. She wore a heavy traveling cloak lined in sable, the hood resting against her shoulders like a mantle of command. Her boots were laced high and clean. At her side, 2 guards stood, hands on their hilts, but still. She walked toward Annika. Her posture was perfect, her steps precise. Her expression was unreadable, not cold, not cruel, just absolute. She stopped 2 paces from the girl whose hands were still dusted with flour. Then, clearly and loudly, she said, "Come with me now, or you will never see him again." Annika did not speak. She did not nod. She did not move toward the Queen Dowager with trembling limbs or an obedient step. She stood still, her breath shallow, the weight of every eye in the courtyard pressing into her skin like frost. Her palms were still dusted in flour. The cold nipped her cheeks, but her face did not falter. She had never been addressed in such a way before, not even by her father when he was younger and stronger, not by the school mistress who had taught her to write her name, and certainly not by a queen. But the voice held no rage, only power. That, Annika understood. Her gaze shifted to Levente, who had not moved from the edge of the courtyard. His face was taut, eyes locked on hers, expression unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't reach for her. and yet every muscle in his body seemed to be resisting the very air between them. Annika turned back to the Queen and gave the smallest of nods. A nod not of submission, but of acceptance. She would go. A lady-in-waiting stepped forward from the open carriage door. Not a guard, not a threat. She was pale, silent, and clothed in somber grey, with gloves that buttoned to the wrist and a ringless hand that gestured without a word. Annika followed her. There were no chains, no restraints, but neither was there freedom in the movement. She was ushered not as a prisoner, but as something more dangerous, an anomaly, an interruption, a possibility that needed to be controlled. The carriage door closed with a hush, its interior warm with velvet and silence. The lady-in-waiting sat across from her, hands folded in her lap, her gaze soft but unblinking. They did not speak on the ride back to the palace. They didn't need to. The message was already clear. Outside, the streets blurred past, shuttered windows, frost-bitten chimneys, the edges of lives Annika had once believed were the only kind that existed. The palace gates loomed ahead, iron and gilded, and the carriage passed through without pause. Inside, the quiet thickened. Annika was taken not to the main receiving hall, but to a private wing, narrower corridors, quiet attendants, candlelight instead of chandeliers. She was led to a bathing chamber, where warm water waited in an enameled tub. Attendants worked without words, their hands quick and methodical. Her dress was removed and replaced with a soft gown of dove-grey muslin, high-necked and modest, the sleeves long and lined with pale silk. Her hair was brushed until it lay smooth and heavy down her back, tied at the base with a thin ribbon the color of old roses. There was no jewelry, no perfume, no pretense, only transformation. When she was ready, the same silent woman escorted her down a narrow passage where a door stood slightly ajar. Annika stepped into the salon. The Queen was waiting. She sat beside the fire in a high-backed chair, her hands resting lightly on the carved arms, her profile illuminated in shifting gold and shadow. She looked like something painted, precise, ageless, difficult to imagine breathing. And yet she was not still. Her fingers moved against one another, slowly, in a gesture that betrayed restlessness beneath all that control. Annika approached and stopped at a respectful distance. Ilona did not rise. "Sit," she said. Annika did. The silence between them stretched for nearly a minute. Then the Queen spoke, quietly, not unkindly. "You have been many things in the last few weeks. A curiosity, a disruption, a test." Annika said nothing. "But you are no longer any of those," the Queen continued. "You are a threat." Still, Annika did not speak. Her heart beat fast, but her face remained composed. Ilona turned her head fully, studying her as if for the first time. "I will offer you two paths," she said, "and I suggest you listen closely." Annika leaned forward just slightly, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "You may walk away now," the Queen said, her voice low and smooth. "I will ensure you live in peace. You will have a home, a dowry, and anonymity. You will never see the inside of this palace again, and you will never hear my son's name spoken in your presence." She paused. "Or you may stay, and watch him fall." Annika's breath caught in her throat. "I will not harm him," the Queen said, almost gently. "But I will see him removed. His reputation will erode, his support in Vienna will crumble, and he will be left not in chains, but in exile. The Empire does not tolerate disobedient heirs, and he will not take the throne with a peasant girl at his side." The silence that followed was deeper than before. Not empty, heavy. Annika felt her fingers tremble, just once, before she clasped them tightly in her lap. "Levente was not born to love," the Queen said, and for the first time there was a crack, faint, almost imperceptible, in her tone. "He was born to rule. That is not cruelty. It is cost." Annika stared at the fire for a long moment. Then she looked back at the Queen, her voice quiet but steady. You speak as if love is a luxury, she said. But for people like me, it isn't. Ilona's eyes narrowed, just slightly. We don't have legacies, Annika continued, or names carved in stone. We survive because someone shares what little they have. Bread, fire, a hand. Her voice trembled now, but she did not stop. The day I gave him that bread, I wasn't thinking about what he could give me. I wasn't thinking at all. But that moment, that was the beginning, not an accident. The Queen did not answer, and then the moment passed. The salon door opened, and the same lady-in-waiting appeared. The court is assembled, she said. Annika was led through back corridors, past closed doors and velvet-lined halls. The palace pulsed with low voices and muffled steps. Somewhere beyond, the winter court had gathered, dignitaries, nobles, advisors, and foreign eyes trained to see power in every breath and weakness in every silence. Annika was not dressed for the gallery. She wore no gloves, no jewels. Her shoes were too plain, and yet no one stopped her. A curtain was drawn, and she stood behind it, just beyond view of the court. The room before her was a sea of brocade and candlelight. White lilies framed the dais, and a high-backed altar stood at its center. There, in formal dress and posture perfect, stood Levente. Beside him, the noblewoman from Vienna, pale, sharp-featured, her gown flawless, her expression unreadable. She held herself with the stillness of someone raised in ceremony. The archbishop opened the book. The rites began. Annika's hands were cold. The words washed over the room, old and solemn. Then came the moment, the pause before consent. Levente turned his head, just slightly. He scanned the rows, ministers, cousins, foreign dignitaries, his mother seated in silence near the front. He did not find her there. He looked higher, to the edge of the gallery. And then his voice rang out, calm, clear, and irrevocable. No. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, movement. But the Queen did not stand. She did not speak. She rose in silence and walked from the chamber, her steps measured, her face untouched. Levente stepped down from the altar. His stride was slow but sure. He crossed the floor, climbed the narrow stair, and stopped at the edge of the curtain where Annika stood. For a moment, neither moved. Then he held out his hand. The court stilled, and after a long, aching breath, she placed hers into it. The winter court dispersed not in a blaze of scandal, but in the hush that followed a tremor. No proclamation rang out, no guards advanced. The archbishop simply closed the ceremonial book. Murmurs took the place of oaths. And through the vaulted hush of the great hall, Levente walked, not hurried, not triumphant, only certain, with Annika beside him. What followed was not exile. It was not coronation. It was something far more delicate, and therefore more dangerous. Transition. In the days after the ceremony, official statements were prepared. The Crown Prince, it was said, had chosen to delay his formal succession in favor of a diplomatic assignment, a journey through the empire's outer provinces. The Queen Dowager, ever a guardian of tradition, supported her son's decision to gain first-hand experience before taking the throne. The court murmured, Vienna watched, and Prague held its breath. Behind the palace walls, Ilona's fury never reached pitch. She did not scream, she did not exile. But her silence became a new form of governance. When she passed Levente in the corridor, her eyes did not linger. She approved his new role with only a signature, nothing more. And if the wound of his refusal bled beneath her composure, no one in the palace dared to name it. She had not lost a son. She had lost a certainty. Levente moved into a suite at the edge of the palace grounds, still royal, but distant from the seat of decisions. He declined public ceremonies. He accepted the post of royal ambassador, beginning preparations for travel that would take him from the Silesian valleys to the mountain towns of Moravia. He did not abdicate. But he stepped out of the rhythm set for him since childhood, and in doing so, redrew the map of what power could look like. He did not issue declarations. He did not crown Annika, but he stood beside her, quietly, again and again. At first, they were seen in the palace gardens, never arm in arm, never holding hands, but near, a quiet, persistent near, a shared book on a bench, a half-eaten roll between them, a glance. Then came the city. Annika did not live in the palace. She refused it, gently but firmly. Instead, she remained near the edge of the second district, close to the weaving houses and bakeries she had known all her life. With Leventi's patronage, a modest building was converted into a foundation, not with grandeur, but with purpose. 2 rooms became a workshop. 1 cellar held dry goods. The rear courtyard was used to bake bread twice weekly, and in time, those who had once passed her in the square without notice began to call her by name. Not lady, not highness, Annika. She remained herself, the girl who had given her last piece of bread. And in doing so, she became something more. Her brother found work with the foundation, delivering parcels to the tenements along the river. Her father's health improved, his hands steadied by warmth and routine. She visited them often, never far from the place where her story had begun. And always, Levente returned. Between journeys, between councils and reports, he came back, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for days, never announced, never with guards, only himself. He did not kiss her in public, but he looked at her as if the world were quieter when she was near, and people noticed. No title was given, no engagement was declared. But across Prague, the whispers changed. They spoke of her not with mockery, not with envy, but with a kind of reverence. The girl who had done what no courtier, no noble, no emissary had dared. She had offered something without asking, and in return had shifted the balance of an entire kingdom. She did not seek influence, but she became the proof of something others had forgotten. That love, when given freely, could be stronger than duty. The months turned. Spring brushed across the city in soft gusts, melting snow from rooftops. Summer followed in golden flashes. And then came winter again, the same chill that had once sunk its teeth into her hands, the same breath of frost that had hollowed Leventi's cheeks in the square. Nearly a year had passed. On a morning layered in white, Annika knelt in the lower marketplace, wrapping a child's hands around a warm roll. The boy, no older than 6, blinked at her with wide, uncertain eyes before running off into the alley with it clutched to his chest. She stood slowly, brushing snow from the hem of her cloak. And there he was, Levente, watching her. No guards, no attendants, just a man standing beneath the archway where a year before he had slumped, starved, and invisible. He didn't speak. He only extended his arm. And she, without question, took it. They walked together through the square, snow dusting their shoulders, past the fountain, past the stalls, past the place where her basket had once carried a single heel of bread. Not as prince and peasant, not as symbol and scandal. Just 2 people, no longer alone, who had chosen, fiercely, quietly, and without apology, each other. They did not look back. Thank you so much for listening to this story, all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to know what moved you most. Was it the snowy square where everything began? The quiet defiance in the palace? Or the moment Annika took his hand in front of the entire court? Tell me in the comments. I truly enjoy reading what you think. Your thoughts not only inspire future stories, but they also help more people discover these tales. So don't be shy. Leave a comment and let me know what stayed with you. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, We want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.